Hi folks, Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational Next Economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Thank you for joining us today, Martin.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me.
It's definitely our pleasure. I would love to just kind of start by asking you about your story, your journey, what brought you to the work that you're doing today, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I work for a small activist collective called The Rules. We work on reframing core narratives and core logics around some big global issues like climate change, poverty, and inequality at the nexus of three things that we work on. And I got here, my background is in largely big not-for-profits, big NGOs, the aid industry. So I was with Oxfam before I came to The Rules, and I was with Save the Children before that, and I was doing domestic HIV activism in the UK before that. But what led me to The Rules specifically and to co-found The Rules with my partner Elnor is when I started to study, when I was at Oxfam, I did a lot of work looking at the psychology of belief. Why do we believe what we do about poverty? Because there was like a hanging question that nobody could answer at that time when we were looking at the polling around people's attitudes to poverty. This was in the UK. And you'd find that there were little blips and ups and downs, but strong support hovered always around like somewhere between 25 and 30% of the population. And so I wanted to understand why 25 to 30%? Why not 35 to 40%? Why not 15 to 20%? What is it about how we understand aid and poverty that creates that little box? And so I started looking into cognition and framing and values theory, cognitive linguistics, social psychology, with a healthy dash of systems theory as well. And what that made me realize, that I hadn't really realized just by dealing with the daily politics of things, is the deep assumptions we all have about why poverty exists, why climate change exists. Basically, we're talking here at the level of our worldviews, our understanding of why the world works the way it does. And in the stories we tell about global poverty, certainly, there are some very deep assumptions that I found I was incredibly uncomfortable with. One of those was that the legitimate response to poverty is charity. That we should all give a little bit, $5 a month for a humanitarian response, or our secondhand clothes, or what we can spare, we give to help alleviate global poverty. And that's the legitimate response. Now, that is the opposite of a political response. That is a response that says you solve poverty by rich people giving a little bit of money to poor people. And it's the counter logic to a systemic logic, to saying there is something in the way this system works that creates poverty at this vast level. So we've had a globalized system for at least 400 years. You can count, depends what you measure, but about, let's just say 400 years, a globalized economy. In that time, we have seen an exponential growth in wealth, especially in the 20th century. Wealth has gone through the roof in terms of financial wealth. And we claim credit for that. But the thing that we don't claim credit for, that we still treat as if it's just some anomaly or something outside the system, is poverty, where actually you can't do that. If you're taking a whole system approach, you have to see the two forces as being part of the flip sides of the same coin. And yet the story we tell about global poverty is very much that it's just this natural thing that just exists in the world, and the way to respond to it is for rich people to give a little bit of money to poor people. It's a great narrative if you're at the top of the pile. It's a horrible narrative if you're anywhere from like midway down. And so that, to be honest, so that was what basically radicalized my politics. Before then, I'd been a lobbyist for Save the Children. I'd been very much in the UN system, in the international aid and development industry, and I was relatively comfortable there. I didn't feel the problems with this narrative when I was living within it. And that was something I found super interesting. But then I started to look at exactly these stories and break it down and work with linguists and social psychologists and really decode the language that we use. And I came across these very, very troubling assumptions. So The Rules is really a project that wants to address those deep assumptions. One of which, so this idea of poverty being natural or created, is one of those kind of deep ideas, deep pieces of logic that we carry around with us that can make a phenomenal difference between how and to our politics, how we respond to poverty. If we believe it's natural, we're much more likely to be passive. But if we see it to be something that's been created, then our first question is who created it and how. And now we're into politics, and now we're looking at the systems and the rules and the norms of the system. So that's what The Rules does. We bring together cognitive discourse analysis with big data and network analysis to decode the narratives that we all live within around poverty, inequality, and climate change, and try to change some of that deep logic. You can think of that deep logic like the soil from which the plant of our action grows. As long as we hold a belief, something like poverty is natural, we are always going to respond in a certain way. But if we can just shift people into seeing poverty as something that's created, the responses become much more substantial and dramatic and political. So that's a little bit about why I do what I do.
Wonderful. And so following, I think I'm in accord with, the observations about beliefs driving kind of behaviors, responses, and these deep-seated, often unquestioned beliefs. Sometimes we talk about belief systems. We call them BS for short. These belief systems that, are derived. I am curious about, something that Buckminster Fuller would always popularize in his talks, thinking about the impact of Malthus and Malthusian scarcity, just that as a belief system. It's one of my favorite questions to ask teenagers. Do you believe there's enough for everybody? Food, water, shelter, for everybody, all humans everywhere. And it's funny when the thing I'm starting to pick up on as a pattern is if they're younger than like 12 or if they're 10 or younger, they tend to, of course, I have food. There's got to be enough for everybody. And then when they get, the cynicism starts to sink in, at least in the States here, right around teenagers. And I don't quite understand how that belief starts to infiltrate in as they become more aware of the world. So one of the posits here is if you could shift those beliefs. So I'm very curious about how, with what you're doing, the theory of change of how beliefs shift, like the how of it is very interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how beliefs do shift. And the posit is if those beliefs shift, then habit, behavior, activity, response will also change. And so I'm kind of curious about some of the mechanics of how, and then what if one were to say, oh, the system is at fault, there's deeper political and systemic forces at play, what then do I do? So I'm curious about both those things.
I mean, yeah, it's interesting because it depends what level you want to start hitting, because at the deepest level, the thing to look for always, the first starting point is metaphor. What metaphors are constructing our reality? And one of the ones you talk about there is almost nature as other, because and that's something that you can track right back to the Neolithic Revolution 10,000 years ago. But the whole, So you can start there, and then you get into conversations about Descartes and the metaphors of the machine world. And is the world a machine, which is the dominant Western metaphor, or is the world an organism, a living organism, which is a metaphor you find riven through most indigenous cultures that have survived this long. A lot of non-Judeo-Christian spiritual traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, lots of those work with that deep metaphor as the world as organism. So in the long span of things, what changes things, if you can change metaphors, you're changing the world. But that's incredibly hard to do and takes an awful long time. Or, I mean, it can be done quickly. It can be done through shocks, exogenous shocks. Something can come along that just kind of changes your view of the world very, very quickly. So it is possible, but in the normal course of events, establishing a deep cultural metaphor is a very difficult long-term thing to do. So you have to go then to the level above that, which is the way we think about we kind of approach the process of change is through studying language, because language is the code that betrays us in a way. We all work with this assumption that because we speak a language, because we are rational, conscious beings who have processes going on in our heads the whole time, we are actually in control of the language we use and we understand how it works. What I found when I first started to look at the narrative of poverty is that we are not in control of the language that we use very much. For example, I'll give you a little story to illustrate that. This was when I was back in one of the big NGOs, and we did a study where we took all of the organization's output for a year, all the fundraising emails, all the appeal emails, all the campaigning emails, the shop posters, the annual reports, everything they put out into the public sphere for a year, and we analysed it through linguistic analysis. And what we found was that this big NGO, that's one of the more radical of the NGOs, that is apparently one of the good guys in the world, that is fighting on behalf of the poor people of the world, raising them up. We found that when you deconstruct and decode their worldview, the worldview they're presenting is that poor people are morally inferior to rich people. Poor people are morally inferior to rich people. Now, if I guarantee I could have stopped any single person in that organization in the corridor and said, do you believe that poor people are morally inferior to rich people? They would have said, absolutely not. Not only do I not believe it, but that's what gets me up in bed, out of bed in the morning and gets me to work, because I see that sort of toxic logic all around me and I want to contribute to the change. And yet, for some reason, in a way that was extremely clear, they were still projecting the view that poor people are morally inferior to rich people, which is an astonishing thing when you stop and think about it. Because the deep framed, what this tells us is the logic that we apply to the world is very often out of our sight and out of our reach. We are not in control of that deep logic worldview. That is encoded into us by the culture into which we were born. Humans are a species that has, evolutionary speaking, selected from a memetic evolutionary path, which is one of the reasons that we're born completely helpless. Because literally, I mean, if you can think of the way a human brain is when it's born in a child, there's no ridges; it's completely blank. Almost any other animal in the world has a degree of autonomy from the moment they are born. Even a gorilla can grip the fur of its mother to hold on. It has an ability to survive and protect itself. Humans, we can't even move our own heads for the first 3 months, and we're completely useless. And that's because one of the things that our evolution has done is mean that when we are introduced to the world, we need imprinting on. The culture into which we are born must imprint itself on us for us to be able to operate in the world. And so we are literally hardwired by the cultural environment that we are born into. These ideas about things like poverty, like how do humans relate to each other, what does it mean for one person to have more than another, those things are our responses to those things. Our understanding of the meaning of those things is encoded into us from a very early age, from in our infancies. And unless we do active work to try and understand, investigate, and engage and change it at that level, we live and we express those cultural norms in a way that we are not in control of. The question then is, okay, so how do you find, what are these cultural norms that are getting in the way and the problematic ones? How do you find them, and then how do you engage them? And we find them through the studying of the discourse on various issues. So we will do things. So we work with big data, a lot of network analysis. And the reason we do that is because what we want to do is to listen to people in the wild, as we call it, like just out there talking to each other, not talking to a pollster, not talking in a focus group, not get rid of that researcher effect. And so we'll we'll get loads of big data. So we use mostly Twitter data right now. We're also starting to be able to scrape from news sites and Facebook. But Twitter's not a bad proxy. If you were going to use any social media site as a proxy to get a window onto the narratives, Twitter's not too bad. It's got some problematic biases in it, but it's not too bad. So that gives, so we'll pull down hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of tweets on a particular narrative. And then we'll do cognitive discourse analysis to decode what's beneath the surface of it. And then we will find the problematic points in that narrative, those points, A, that we think we can affect, but B, that are at the deepest level, that will have if you can shift at this level, it will have the greatest ripple effect. So to give an example, one of the things, so as I was mentioning earlier, when we first set up the rules, we did a study. We just pulled a bunch of the big NGOs in the UN and the World Bank and the people who talk about poverty at the global level. We pulled their stuff together. We had another kind of quick skim of it. And one thing we found was that conspicuous by its absence was a creation story of poverty. Nobody talks about where poverty comes from. People only talk about what to do about it now it's here. Now that belies the truth that we were talking about earlier, is that there's this dominant cultural belief that poverty is just this natural state. The poor will always be with us, as it says in the Bible. That's been deeply embedded into our psyches, that sense. And so it leads you to this place where poverty is dealt with as if it's just this natural foe that everybody can get behind. Every politician, every activist, every corporation can be a hero in a story where nobody's to blame for anything. And so it serves the interests of pretty much anybody who wants to be in this conversation, almost, to treat it as natural, because there's no blame to be found, to be attached to anybody. So through that process, we isolated this problem, the idea of poverty is created versus poverty is natural. And we work a lot on the idea that poverty is natural. So then when we, to give an example of some work that we did on that, in 2015, the United Nations released their Sustainable Development Goals, which were the follow-up from the Millennium Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals contain within it, they have a beautiful, I mean, the first time you read the documents, you're inspired. I mean, they're wonderful. They talk about ending poverty by 2030, ending global hunger, transforming education system and healthcare systems. I mean, it's pure idealism stuff. It's great as an objective for the world. What they're trying to aim at, wonderful, no complaints. Dig beneath the surface, and you start to hit up some very problematic political and cultural worldviews. One of which you see the idea that poverty is natural, riven through the language. Another point that became very apparent there is, although they're called the Sustainable Development Goals, everything about them hangs off the idea of infinite economic growth. There is no way the Sustainable Development Goals can be met without significant economic growth. There was one economist that I think was UNCTAD who calculated that to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, what we're actually saying is we want a median global income of 100,000 a year. That's what they're promising to get us to by 2030. But not only promising to get us there, but they're saying that's basically a very good thing. But then now, if you just you lay that against what growth does to this planet, economic, unfettered, totalitarian economic growth. Because when we talk about growth, we're not just talking about growth of the economy like one thing. What we're saying is every government, every corporation, every small business, every individual has to grow their material wealth all the time. That is the objective of this economy. That's what powers it. And that is obviously destroying the web of life on this planet right now. I mean, there's if you just look at resource use. Right now, the safe limit for resource use is about 50 billion tons a year. That's how much materials, wood, fish, plastics, or fossil fuels, everything that we can consume every year without destroying the web of life. We're currently at about 80, so we're overshooting by about 60%, which means we're digging into the capital support of the planet. We're playing a very, very dangerous game, and business as usual scenarios get us to about 180 billion tons by 2050. 180 billion tons on a planet that can withstand 50 billion tons. that is civilization game over kind of stuff we're talking about there. So growth is phenomenally problematic dynamic in this economy. The fact that it is oriented around perpetual growth is taking us to the brink of existential ruin. And yet the United Nations' biggest plan for how to deal with poverty and sustainability and the health of the system and, all of it is to grow us by about 15 times the size of the current economy. I mean, it's the cognitive dissonance is the polite way of saying it. The cognitive dissonance at the heart of these plans is phenomenal. And it's not just the Sustainable Development Goals. You look at the Paris Climate Agreement. They're all fixed on green growth, this idea that you can grow greenly. And so you've got this core piece of logic now that we've identified, that we know. I mean, you can come at it from an economic point of view. You can come at it from an ecological point of view. If you come at it from a cognitive point of view, what it looks like is a piece of logic in our worldviews says unconditionally that treats the concept of growth as common sense. Growth is good. It's treated as a statement of common sense for most people. How could the economy work without this? So now you've isolated a piece of logic. Growth is good. How do you challenge that? Then there comes a question, how do you challenge it? Well, there's no one answer for this. There are any number of ways you can do it. We know the limitations of just using facts and figures for people. So you've got to get into smart communication. You've got to get into mimetic thinking here. One of the ways that we're doing it is when we did the Sustainable Development Goals, we constructed a set of 3 questions. Because when you're trying to do campaigning work in this sort of way, change people's beliefs, it's not very efficient just to tell people what you think they should think. Growth is bad. Everybody believe me. Everybody sign a petition that says growth is bad. It's not a very engaging. That doesn't actually move people's thinking along much.
I haven't seen that work yet.
Yeah, exactly. It gets you the usual suspects. Everybody feels good that they've done their thing for the day and they've said, yes, I think growth is bad too, but it doesn't actually move you on. So you have to engage people at the depth of their logic. So the way we did this was construct 3 questions around the SDGs. One was, why is growth the only answer? The other was, who's developing who? Because when you look at resource flows, there's this another piece of logic in the global development narrative is that the rich develops the South. We, with our foreign aid and our big budgets and our technology, we are the ones helping the South, the global South, develop. When actually it's almost through the exploitative logic of the capitalist system, it's almost the exact opposite. The North is plundering the South in order to develop itself, and it is deliberately keeping the South underdeveloped because that gives it access to cheap resources and cheap labor. So who's developing who? Why is growth the answer? Who's developing who? And how is poverty created? To go to that other one. And then we worked with a whole bunch of journalists, friendly journalists. We made a bunch of our own materials, some videos, some infographics. And we really targeted NGO development people because when you think of it, they are upstream of the public narrative. They are the ones that start the narrative. They're the ones that genuinely set the frame, set the norms, with the rest of us just pick up on it largely. So we targeted them because if we can get them to change how they talk about it, if we can just get one G7 government to stop saying that poverty is natural, that's a phenomenal evolution, like intervention into the flow of idea evolution, because ideas are not static anyway. So what you want to do is think of ideas as things that are naturally evolving. It's going to be different tomorrow than today, whether I'm here or not. So what can I do to help it tip in a particular direction rather than another? So if you think of flows like that, so if you drop this idea that, for example, growth is not good upstream into the cognitive flow of the development industry, the hypothesis is it flows throughout into the mainstream narrative, which starts to change public mainstream kind of thought. And to a degree, we've been relatively successful in that, in the sense that we know, we've tracked a lot of shifts in how some of the NGOs talk about poverty. We've seen an uptick in some pretty radical thought in a couple of key little nodes, one of which is in the UK, where Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is showing a lot of interest in thinking beyond the growth logic. And they've picked up on yes, it's a long story, but yes, we can track the flow of that logic that we put into the SDG stream through to some very exciting stuff happening in the development scene there, including possibly, Labour in the Labour Party in the UK is completely revisioning its development policy from a worldview with this much more radical core in it. And they're even looking at the idea of post-growth in the meta UK economy. Is the UK going to move beyond GDP as a measure of growth? That's an active and live question right now. And we think we can track a little bit of that back to some of the work we did. I mean, it's very difficult. Causality is a really complicated thing in this area. And we wouldn't want to actually kind of claim any sort of credit at all. But we can see a consistency between what was being done there and through to what's now being coming out in the Labour Party. So that's how we go about the process of change.
Appreciate that. And so one of the things I heard there was that directly confronting a belief system with the alternative is maybe not effective, but carefully crafting questions that allow for the person who holds the kind of business as usual belief system, the cultural and normal belief system, to use the questions as a scaffolding to build a greater understanding, a different understanding, that is one of the ways in which their belief could be amended or transformed just through creatively inserting questions. That
was a big inflection point for us, to be honest, when we had it's one of those thoughts, as soon as you think of it, you go, why did it take me so long to think that? But yeah, people don't respond well to being told what to do and what to think. No, none of us do. And it's actually not a good way to engage people's thoughts and beliefs. So literally didactic telling is problematic. Questioning is I'd encourage people, if you want to default to one option or not, telling or questioning, I'd always say questioning. It's not like a rule of thumb that you can use, is perfect for every situation. But yes, if you want to engage people at the level of their beliefs, don't just expect them to take yours on in some sort of didactic sense. You'll only get the people who already believe you that way.
One thing that I'm curious about is how, if I reflect on my own transformations of belief and what I've observed in others as well, it seems to me that one prerequisite for actually transforming belief is maybe a sense of psychological safety. If I'm not safe to try on a new idea or a new possibility because it's not psychologically safe, if I'm going to be judged or not accepted, that it becomes exponentially more difficult to, or it becomes much easier to just entrench and defend the existing belief. And so a question is less confrontational, so a little bit more safe. Are there other ways that you can use language to create more sense of safety, or beyond questioning, what's maybe one more example of another mechanism for shifting these beliefs?
Another way we did it in the past, we ran a campaign in 2015 called Seeing Wetiko. Now, Wetiko is this fantastic concept that comes from lots of First Nations across North America. Wetiko is an Algonquin word, but it's also, there's Wetiko or Wetiko. There's lots of variants of it in various First Nations across the US. And what it basically is, they would call it a spirit. We would call it maybe a thought form or a meme or a thought complex that convinces its host that the consumption of the life force of others, other than a grander sense, not just people, but other plants, other animals, for the purpose of self-aggrandizement, is a logically and morally upright way to live. It's a kind of cannibalistic logic, especially it's cannibalistic when you take an indigenous worldview that sees the world as an organism. The consumption of that organism for selfish purposes is a form of cannibalism in that paradigm. And what we wanted to see is if we could encourage people to see Wetiko in themselves, in the world around them, just to identify, look at it, see it. Because one of the antidotes to kind of toxic thought forms is awareness of it. In the same way that if I go back to the NGO example, where if you ask people whether they believe poor people are morally inferior to rich people, they'd be horrified by the idea. But if you show them this is what you're saying, now they're aware of it, they can correct for it. But they weren't even aware of it, so they have no chance of correcting for it in the past. So anyway, we wanted to get people to reflect on and see this Wetiko thing. And what we did there was, rather than just pump out and produce it in our own form, we crowdsourced creative expression. So we did a little grant scheme where we got all over the world. We put out a call, like a creative pitch, and said, how do you see Wetiko? So what you're doing there is you ask, it's deeper even than questioning, because what you're asking people to do is engage their creative abilities to express, and that's full, hardcore cognitive engagement when you're doing it that way, because you're having to think about how you would express it afresh, which is a very powerful cognitive thing to do. Now, obviously, these are pretty high bar things. You're not going to get you're not going to get millions and millions and millions of people doing this. But just as another example of a way to engage people, that is a much better way to engage people, even though it's a smaller bar, than petitions and things with mass numbers, which just gets people to, say, use their brain very, very lightly in most cases.
Right.
Yeah.
So having people construct their own cognitive articulation by inviting that possibility, and inviting them to articulate it, that's highly constructive in terms of the maybe ability to create new beliefs. And so in the articulation, their own articulation of the language through that carefully constructed invitation to articulate it, if you do that with people who are in the position to set narratives for many others, like you're saying, people who have the informal power of messaging and who control messages through media or as a NGO leadership or other roles, that's a way to then transform kind of the norms of the cultural narrative, which then could lead to, it's much easier to, there would create psychological safety, because if all my parents and all my peers and all the media I'm reading is saying something, it's much safer for me just to opt into that than the obsolete one. So it sounds like part of what the rules does is focus on the high leverage areas, people who are setting the messaging. And if you can influence there, then you can scale the influence.
Yeah. So it is, yes. It's those two things really. It's those high influencer types, and it's also been just using a narrative methodology to isolate almost the leverage points in their thing. So with growth, for example, we know growth is so deeply embedded in us. As I say, it feels like common sense. And that's when you know something is very deeply embedded, because it just has that feeling of, yeah, of course, why would I have to think about it? So you can't just hit that head on as well, in a way, especially with economists and some. But we know that there's stuff happening. For example, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, recently, she's been saying a lot of interesting things around GDP, moving New Zealand away from GDP as a measure of progress, which is one step towards a post-growth. It doesn't get you to post-growth by itself, because all it says is you've got to raise up ecological and social impacts along and treat them as important as economic growth in a kind of simple sense. So that could lead you down a direction that's going to get you to a post-growth place. If the ecological and social impacts are repeatedly seen to be so dire, you might choose to sacrifice economic growth, but that's quite a long process. And you can imagine through real politics and like actual political processes, you're talking, that's barring beneficial acts of God, that's probably decades of work required to do that. So how can you shortcut that? That's the question. So people will inevitably go, we live in a growth world. Okay, if you can get them to accept that there's some problems with growth, they'll probably go to a post-GDP place. But wait a second, then you don't want them to have to spend 10 years to get to the post-growth place. We know that there's this concept of green growth that is normally one of the paths along that path, one of the steps along that path. So we go beyond where people are. We know that if we can seed doubt about, and that's what you need to do. You need to seed doubt about green growth, the feasibility of green growth. What you're actually doing is you're working to undermine the core logic of growth itself, and you're seeing the process that people go through to go from I'm perfectly comfortable with growth, it's never occurred to me there's anything wrong with it, all the way through to, Christ, the planet's going to, human civilization is going to collapse if we don't deal with this growth question. They will inevitably go through certain phases. So with the green growth work that we're doing right now, for example, we've made a video and we've got some infographics that basically point to the problems of the idea of green growth. It's kind of physical impossibilities. You're shortcutting the process to get people to the point of accepting or starting to reflect on a post-growth logic paradigm. So you find the right people, hit them in the right place, and you start to get a little bit of hopefully change.
I appreciate that articulation of the methodology and the approach. I'm curious if you could just reflect on or share about some of the work you're doing around some of the post-growth possibilities, like the formulation and design of universal basic income, some of the ideation and work that the Rules is doing around that. That'd be very interesting to our listeners.
Yeah, this is a really good, interesting case study, actually. So universal basic income, it's an idea that's on lots of people's minds at the moment. It's a very interesting political proposition, not just for its kind of purist policy perspectives, but also its kind of social and political profile. It's, libertarians like it for certain reasons, centrists like it, radical leftists like it, all for different reasons, mind. But it's got this across the board kind of sense of, this is something that should probably happen in some way. And you're seeing, pilots everywhere from Alaska to New Zealand and all points in between. So it's a very live, active conversation in policy circles, largely. But this is another good example of what on the surface looks like lots of interesting agreement on something. Dig beneath the surface, and actually there's an awful lot of problems and barriers to this. So we did a study of the UBI narrative. We pulled down all these tweets and we did media studies and we did all these things, looked at the whole narrative, and we found two very interesting features of it. One is, and this is slowly changing, but only slowly, certainly hasn't changed too much yet as far as we can tell. It is very northern, white, male-dominated conversation, and academic largely. So the idea, as I'm sure you know, Kevin, is an idea with a very long history. It goes all the way back to Thomas Paine and all that sort of thing. And it's lived in policy circles and academic circles for a long time and had little bits of interest and up and down. But its frames have been set in academia, largely. And one of the ways that it is conceived of, or one of the dominant ways it's conceived of, is a form of welfare. So you find this framing of UBI everywhere. It is the dominant one, without question. And what welfare is, to go back to where we started this conversation, is basically national charity for poor people. That's how it's understood. So in conceiving of a universal basic income as a form of welfare, we are taking what could be a very powerful transformative idea and reducing it down to its most incremental potential.
Which would just reinforce that belief system that there's poverty as a natural state and,
just replicate old power structures.
Yeah.
Exactly. So right now, in the next couple of years, we'll determine this. Is UBI going to be a technology or an idea that helps us transition to a new economic model, or is it going to be one that reinforces the old? That's the kind of decision point around, or one way of seeing a decision point around UBI right now. Obviously, our interest is in encouraging it to be seen as an idea that can take us beyond growth at all costs capitalism, and we think it has that potential. But there are bits about the language that militate against that. If you just take the words universal basic income, each one of those words is a problem. When you talk to people about universal in these sorts of contexts, that normally triggers competitive in-group thinking in people, because you see this a lot. It's the reason why whenever you start talking about this, people will go immediately to questions like, where does the money come from? Because they kicks in a fairness logic in people. If it's universal, why is my neighbor over there getting as much as I am and I work harder than him or her or them? It triggers that sort of thinking. That's not particularly helpful. Basic is a word that brings you down to the floor. What's the least possible we can give people? The least possible. So in your brain, you're calculating for the least, not what's required for other purpose, but what's the least. And income is almost the worst, because income is widely understood as money you receive for work. And yet this whole idea is about delinking money and work.
Right.
So that's just one example of where the language itself militates against the conception of
possible outcomes. Yeah.
Possible outcomes of it. Yeah. So you've got that, and you've got the welfare frame, which is very problematic, and then you've got the fact that it's characterized as being set by white, academic, northern policy type people, which inevitably in many cases, saps it of radical potential and transformative potential.
Yeah.
So we like the idea because it does have this transformative potential to it. So the way the rules approaches this is, how can we popularize, socialize the more radical conception of this idea? And what we're doing, we're building an actual a blockchain-based cryptocurrency-focused UBI delivery mechanism that will work in communities for two reasons. One, the best way, in what we were saying earlier, if you want to engage people's brains, the least effective way of doing it is just to tell them what you think. The more effective way of doing it is to ask them what they think. The most powerful way is to give them the full experience, an experience of a different option of something. So we want to give people the experience of living what life can be like in a community, very important that it's community focused, in a community with a crypto-based UBI. What would that look like? So we can give people a direct experience and then we can tell lots of stories about it. So it gets a double hitter. You kind of work with those communities and then you hit the wider narrative by telling stories about that. So yeah, we'll be rolling that out over the course of this year. We're working with some people from Consensus and some developers and DAPHub and folks like that to develop the Circles model that we'll be releasing. And it's not, the way we approach it, this is not an off-the-shelf solution that we're providing.
Right.
You don't want that, because again, if people can just take it off the App Store or whatever, off the shelf, again, that's the least engaging thing. So you want to engage, so it's a almost ready solution, and we want to engage people in answering the final questions about it. So we're treating it more like a Linux. Let's build a community of practice around this thing. Mm-hmm. Let's do a marketing exercise around the new app. Again, to get to that level, a deeper level of cognitive engagement with people. Let's see where it goes. When you've got Facebook founders and Elon Musk's and Richard Branson's of this world talking about UBI, it's quite an uphill struggle. But there are things you can do, to help yourselves with that. With smart targeting and really clear framing.
Yeah, and if people are talking about it, it's a potentially potent intervention. I'm really curious about things that are inspiring you, things you're looking at and reading that you think Next Economy Now listeners might be interested in, or just things that are inspiring you that you're watching.
I've been getting really into a lot of Jeremy Rifkin's work recently, third and fourth industrial revolution stuff. I would encourage people to look there. I like the way that he sees the building blocks. And I like the scale he talks at. He's one of the few people who has his ideas. He thinks in tectonic civilizational level stuff. There's a great Vice documentary that just came out about a talk he gave that I'd encourage people to look at, Third Industrial Revolution. That one's really good. Actually, I'm also looking quite a lot at game theory right now. I'm reading Finite and Infinite Games by James Cass because I find it's incredibly difficult. One of the big problems we have right now is collectively as a species, our sense-making has gone awry. We are not connected to reality anywhere near enough to weather what's coming down the pipe at us over the next 20, 30 years. Our political systems particularly, but also our corporate systems are just not making sense of the world in a way that they can respond adequately to. And that's, you can easily get into a blame game here, but if you stand back and go, why are we not sensing these things, sensing particularly ecological pressures and climate change right now? Although you could say the same thing for any of the major global threats, pandemics, for runaway AI, for financial fragility, any of these things, all of these existential threats that we have are now piling on top of each other. The feedback loops, the worst case scenarios that you can get to are, you get right up to near-term human extinction without having to stretch credulity too far. When you're in a system that's this complex, when the feedback loops are this dynamic. And so this is one of the reasons that I find game theory quite helpful, because it does it gives you a paradigm for thought that allows you to stand far enough back to look at the global dynamics at their most profound. And one of the things they show us is that actually humanity is at war with itself right now. We are fighting to lose this game right now. We're fighting each other because we're not seeing the bigger threats, and that's to do with our sense making. So I'm getting very inspired by people like James Cass and people who are, and that's at the grand conceptual level. And then there's a whole other track of work that I'm fascinated in right now, which is super micro, super local, which is how do you transition like a small community to a new economy framework? What is right at the heart of that? Because the more I look into it, the more encouraged I become, really, in this world where there is so much to be miserable and desperate about and feel despairing of. Actually, there's so much good news and good stories going on, and the potential for us making this shift to a new economy is so real and active and live, and we can be very, very blind to it. but actually just dealing with the energy infrastructure, communications infrastructure, and agriculture and food.
Yeah.
And you have the makings of the new economy there, and it can be done, and it is being done all over the place locally first.
Yeah.
This is not going to be a national government plan. Anywhere in the world, this is not going to be a national government plan. We have to see the new system from the bottom up, which is almost jargony. You speak to people and oh yes, bottom up change, but it's real, and it is happening. It's not happening anywhere near on the scale fast enough.
Yeah.
And I veer between violent hope and violent despair on, probably several times a day some days. But I do think that there is an awful lot of good news going on.
Most definitely. Well, I'm drawing the observation that these two things are not mutually exclusive. Bottom up in terms of solution development and local self-determination and autonomy and a post-growth kind of economy that works for everybody. And then some of the top down is inserting and developing messaging and new narratives. This is the rules work, and those things actually connect where the transformation of the system actually begins to support all the local initiatives that are happening.
Starts to become self-organized and self-generating.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you highlighting those emergent probabilities, and I really enjoyed talking to you. And I feel I have a much better understanding of the work that you're doing. It's really important work. And I don't know that anybody's really focusing on the narrative and belief system level work with that much intention and kind of rigor in analysis. So I appreciate the novelty of what you're doing. I'm so glad somebody's doing it.
Great, thank you.
I also appreciate the courage to create a kind of community practice around some of the solution development as well. I like the framing of your project. It's great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That concludes this episode of Next Economy Now, and now on to our mini interview with Doug Bistry, CEO of Clearinghouse CDFI.
Okay, welcome, Doug, to this interview series, the Next Economy Now podcast. And for listeners, I think one of the reasons I'm excited about Clearinghouse CDFI is that you're a lot different than other financial institutions. And what's the difference for folks who don't know between, say, a bank and a CDFI?
Well, the obvious difference is that a bank typically takes deposits and has FDIC insurance. And a CDFI, while there are some bank CDFIs, typically CDFIs don't take deposits. And typically the loans that a CDFI is making are much more difficult. They sort of fall outside the parameters of what a conventional bank, a regulated financial institution, typically does. And so by definition, a CDFI should be addressing unmet credit need. They should be stretching the envelope, trying to do deals that a traditional or conventional financial institution either won't or can't do because of regulatory or just their internal practices.
Right. So banks, maybe their bread and butter is, say, home loans or business loans that are very straightforward, whereas a CDFI, are you doing more complex things? Is that kind of, if I understand it?
Yeah, we are. It's more complex, and it's also, we have the ability to stretch the underwriting parameters. And what I mean is we're not interested in making loans that are extremely risky or where there's, a roll of the dice chance of getting paid back. But what we can do is we can look at some things that banks typically can't. We can look at the character of the borrowers. We can look at plans, business projections, and we have the ability to sort of do things that a regulated bank simply can't, because when a regulated financial institution has their regulator come in and is looking at their loans and they say, my gosh, this loan you made, it doesn't have great collateral or the debt coverage ratio is very low, that bank would be penalized for that. As a CDFI, we don't have the same type of regulatory pressure. So that allows us to really do loans that are sort of outside of the parameters of what a bank can do. And for us, and I think most CDFIs, every loan we make has some sort of a tangible community benefit or impact. And that is really important to us. So we're looking at that as much as we are looking at the creditworthiness of the borrower.
And is the reason that banks are so constrained is that they're using consumer deposit capital to make the loans? So that's why they're higher, sort of more highly regulated?
That's exactly right. When you walk into a bank and you see that it says, this bank has FDIC insurance, why that is, in fact, a government protection up to $250,000 of every depositor's money. And so the government then has the right to sort of step in and say to the banks, well, look, if we're going to provide this insurance to you, we're going to look over your shoulder and we're going to make sure that you're making appropriate loans and not taking excessive risk. Now, we all know how well that went in the last financial crisis, given what transpired with the banking industry. But nonetheless, they still have that parameter. We still have that in place. And there is still sort of I'll call it a culture and a practice within regulated financial institutions of being conservative, of not taking risk, of trying to do loans that are, very cookie cutter and don't pose any sort of unnecessary risk to the bank and ultimately to the depositors at that bank.
And where can folks learn more about Clearinghouse and, say if there's any investors who are interested, what's the best way for them to get in contact?
We have a great website that has a ton of information, including our financials. It is www.ccdfi.com. Again, that's ccdfi.com. And a lot of information there. There's contact numbers. I'd be happy to talk to anybody that is serious about investing or working with us. And also, we're looking for projects to lend, good projects. And so in our service areas, California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and all of Indian country throughout the United States. So if anyone is aware of an unmet credit need that has good community impact, or, often our loans are made to entrepreneurs, people of color, or members of groups that have been disenfranchised. And if anyone is aware of loans, boy, we'd love to hear from them as well.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.